Duggan for scheduling her talk on this bleak, rainy day. I didn't anticipate it. There are people in their offices now looking out the window and saying, should I walk across? I'll talk to Anne later on. My introduction of Anne today is going to be very, very brief because I've been mandated to do so. And Anne has grown up now, and I have to listen to what she says to me. So I just say that she's an associate professor of French and chair of the Department of Classical and Modern Languages, Literatures, and Cultures. And that her most recent book, Queer Enchantments, Gender, Sexuality, and Class in the Fairy Tale Cinema of Jacques Demar, will be coming out in French translation. And with Christina Bachilega, and is co-editor of the journal Marvels and Tales, Journal of Fairy Tale Studies, and she's a co-editor with Don Hasse on folk tales and fairy tale traditions and texts from around the world. She received her PhD in French literature from the University of Minnesota in September 1998, and the Wayne State University's talent scouts were perspicacious enough to recruit her right away for our French program, and she hit the ground running and is still striding. Some of her research interests and teaching interests are early modern literature and culture, fairy tale studies, early modern women writers, and the tragic story, and Orientalism. I hope she'll let me say that I am absolutely grateful to her as director of the Humanities Center for her participation in support of the Humanities Center. Not only did she say nice things about us, but she has proved her friendship by her participation. I'll tell you a little bit. She was a part of our advisory board from 2003 to 2005. This is her 5th Brumback talk, starting in 2002. And she was a resident scholar for in the 2003 year and in the 2008 and 2009 year. She has participated in working groups, interdisciplinary approaches to folklore, folk tales, interdisciplinary approaches to Arabian Nights, the Fold, Theory and Practice, Modern Cultures, Gender and Sexuality, Fairy Tales. All those are working groups that she has participated in. She has presented at 1, 2, 3, 4 of our faculty fellowship conferences. She won one of our Innovative Projects Awards, and she participated in one of our fall symposiums. So she has been very active and very supportive. Today, her Brumback presentation is going to be entitled Binary Outlaws, Queering the Classical Tale in Francois Ozon's Criminal Lovers and Catherine Villas' Sleeping Beauty. So please welcome to the podium on this bleak day, but give her a warm applause.
Thank you. And just before I start, I wanted to let everyone know that our graduate students have organized a conference for this Saturday, and another one of our fairy tale colleagues, Kimberly Lau, who's a professor at the University of Santa Cruz, is going to be giving the keynote talk. So I encourage any of you, if you have any time on Friday, and there's free lunch and perhaps some vino afterwards. Anyway.
Is it Friday or Saturday?
Right, Saturday, yes. This is a piece that that is actually going to come out in a teaching volume on fairy tales. So I think I took out the more pedagogical sounding things, but there still might be traces of it there. Okay, so I'll just jump into this. Within the domain of fairy tale studies, queer theory has yet to receive the critical attention it deserves. particularly given the centrality of sexuality in fairy tales. This situation increasingly is changing, evident in the work of Pauline Greenhill and Kay Turner, among others. Approaching fairy tale texts and films from the perspective of queer theory can help us understand the ways in which fairy tale plots can subvert what is often and problematically taken for granted in classical tales, the heteronormative plot upheld by a specific configuration of gender roles. As Turner has argued, even if many tales hurtle headlong towards normative reunion, marriage, and stability, often the route navigates a topsy-turvy space filled with marvels, magic, and weird encounters that don't simply contradict the normal, but offer, or at least hint at, alternative possibilities for fulfilling desires that might alter individual destinies. French fairy tale films provide a particularly compelling area of study with respect to queer theory because of the existence of a genealogy of French queer directors, including Jean Cocteau, Jacques Denis, and François Ozon, who have drawn from the fairy tale genre to represent non-normative forms of sexuality. Although Catherine Breillat is not considered a queer director, her cinematic work can fit broadly into the notion of queer in its subversion of normative forms of heterosexuality. Drawing on Hansel and Gretel and Sleeping Beauty, Ozon and Breillat queer the fairy tale in at least 3 ways. First, both films destabilize normative gender roles, either emphasizing the implicit complexity or challenging the normative representation of gender in the source tale. Second, just as characters move between masculinity and femininity, characters also drift between heterosexual and homosexual relations, challenging clear delineations between gay and straight. Third, through the staging of the main character's sexual initiation, both films suggest that the climax of the heteronormative fairy tale plot may not, in the end, be all that it is cut out to be. Both films challenge the classical heteronormative tale through their binary outlaws, thus generating new queer fairy tale forms. Considered by some to be France's first mainstream queer auteur, Ozon blends film noir with fairy tale to create Criminal Lovers. The first part of the action, to which we return throughout the film in several flashbacks, revolves around the high school student Alice, who wishes to kill her classmate, the French North African Saïd, for desiring her, and her boyfriend Luc, who cannot manage to have an erection with her. In order to push Luc into killing Saïd, Alice lies to Luc, telling him that Saïd was involved in her gang rape, which never happened. Alice seduces Saïd in the shower of the gymnasium in order to allow Luc to stab him with Saïd's own switchblade, which he had stolen earlier in the film. They drag Saïd's body to their car, drive off to the woods, robbing a jewelry store along the way. It's when they arrive at the forest that the narrative turns into a queer variation of a Hansel and Gretel-like tale. In this second narrative strand, Alice and Luc drag Saïd's body through the forest to bury him, but realize they lost their trail and begin to wander. Eventually, Luc finds the cabin of the ogre, a large foreign accented man whom Luc voyeuristically watches bathe. Later, when the man appears to be away, Luc returns to his cabin with Alice. They enter the cabin, and hungry, they start devouring bread, and it, of course, is reminiscent of Hansel and Gretel when they start eating the witch's house. Suddenly, the ogre returns and throws Alice and Luc into the cellar, where, to the children's astonishment, they find Saïd's dead body. Later, the ogre takes Luc out of the cellar, feeds him, and has the boy assist him with domestic chores, including bathing him. And it's interesting that he's got his gun while he's being bathed. On 2 occasions, the ogre brings Luc to orgasm. In the meantime, a starving and powerless Alice remains in the cellar, and Luke secretly feeds her an gun that's reminiscent of Hansel and Gretel when Gretel sneaks food to Hansel and then he sticks the bone out to show that he hasn't gained weight. Finally, Luke manages to free Alice and they flee the ogre's cabin. They start making love before a waterfall in an idyllic and explicitly Disney-like scene surrounded by woodland creatures. So you have all the animals, you know, the rabbit, the fox, and I love the next one. There's a dove looking at them, the deer, and then my favorite is the little hedgehog at the bottom there. So they start making love before a waterfall in an idyllic and explicitly Disney-like scene surrounded by woodland creatures, but they are interrupted with the arrival of the police. The police kill Alice while Luke and the ogre are taken into custody, with Luke yelling at the police to leave the ogre alone. The film presents many interesting overlaps and contrasts with the Grimm's Hansel and Gretel, summarized in Table 1, from which we gain several insights into the filmic adaptation of the tale. In some respects, Alice's character recalls that of the bad stepmother in the Grimm tale. It is her impulse to kill that sets the action into motion, and like the bad stepmother, she's purged from the story at the tale's conclusion. Whereas in the Grimm tale, Hansel is the active character in the first part of the story, and Gretel the active character in the second. In Ozon's film, this is reversed, and it is Alice who dominates in the first part of the film, and Luke in the second. That Luke is feminized is evident in his implicit identification with Gretel, given the structure of the story, as well as in his inability to perform his male role sexually with Alice. Significantly, when Alice prepares to seduce Saeed before the pair kills him, it is Luke who expertly applies her makeup onto Alice and even looks into the mirror with Alice as the two faces seem to blend together, which also makes me think of Bergman's Persona with the blurring of the characters. For her part, Alice often plays a masculine role in her sexual domination of Luke and in her leadership and cunning in devising the plan to kill Saeed, the racial other whom both characters desire, a taboo desire they need to repress or kill. Luke and Alice, then, are both masculine and feminine, passive and active, predator and prey. Interestingly, this is also true for the Grimm tale. Hansel is active and passive, Gretel is passive and active. The siblings are the witch's prey, then the witch becomes the prey of the children, and specifically Gretel. Gender and subject positions are mutable, mobile, and unstable in both the tale and the film, and one could argue that the film actually brings out that instability in the source tale. Hunger and food are important themes in the tale and the adaptation, taking on sexual dimensions in Ozon's film. When Luke and Alice arrive at the ogre's cabin, they are famished. Later, the ogre has Luke eat rabbit as well as the film suggests, part of Saeed's leg. He's been taken back to the cabin. Saeed's connection to the rabbit is made earlier when Luke hits a rabbit on the road leading to the forest where they plan to bury Saeed. Alice insists that they bury the rabbit before burying Saeed, thus creating a metonymic and a metaphoric connection between the two murdered creatures. Interestingly, the ogre refers to Luke as mon lapin, my little rabbit, when he takes Luke out of the cellar to play a domestic role in his home. In this way, Luke becomes, in Andrew Azabong's words, the foreign body we always thought of as somebody or something else, moving from predator to prey, from same to other within the film. Now it is the ogre who will devour here sexually his little rabbit, Luke. It should be noted as well that one could view the killing of Saeed as a sexual act or rape. Before the murder, Luke and Alice caress Saeed's switchblade, which we could look at as a sort of phallic figure, that Luke stole from him, and they use this switchblade to penetrate and kill him. But Luke is not simply a victim of the ogre. The ogre releases Luke to his own queer desires. It is only through sexual relations with the ogre that Luke can fully access his own sexuality, orgasm, and finally at least begin to make love to Alice until they're interrupted by the police. Indeed, the film pushes us to ask ourselves what happens if Hansel falls in love with the ogre or Gretel with the witch. As such, the film demonstrates the point of Turner's piece, Playing with Fire, a queer reading of Frau Trudy, in which Turner argues that the girl whose curiosity impels her to visit the marginalized witch, in fact, desires the older woman who is the forbidden object of desire. What Turner teases out of the grim tale becomes explicit in the filmic tale of Ozon. The boy very clearly desires the ogre, evident the first time Luke gazes upon the ogre while the latter bathes. Although Criminal Lovers does not conclude with the happy ending of Hansel and Gretel, that is, with the reestablishment of the patriarchal heteronormative home, there is this sort of union between the ogre and Luke, both of whom will find themselves not within the space of the home, but with the diametrically opposite space of the prison. One wonders what Ozon is trying to say here about queer desire and its place in French society in the late 1990s. Ozon's characters can be considered binary outlaws in several respects. First, Luke and Alice constantly move between conventionally masculine and feminine roles. Alice is a sexual aggressor, Luke is passive, and later carries out domestic work usually associated with women. Alice is victimized by the ogre, while Luke plays the traditional hero, and he ends up saving her. The comparison with Hansel and Gretel emphasizes the gender fluidity of the source tale, on which Ozon capitalizes for his film. Second, Luke moves between heterosexuality and homosexuality. In order to gain access to heterosexuality or his sexuality more generally, Luke must pass through a homosexual initiation that frees up his desire. Luke's inability this time due to the arrival of the police to complete the heterosexual act, however, and his longing gaze at the ogre at the end of the film as they're both taken into custody would suggest that Luke's desire for a man is privileged over any desire he might have for Alice. For her part, Alice plays the dominant, traditionally masculine role in heterosexual relations with Luke, and even with Saeed, whose murder could be read as a rape murder she oversees in the way that it plays out, an ironic turn of events given her earlier accusations towards Saeed. Breillat's filmic adaptation of Charles Perrault's Sleeping Beauty presents interesting connections and contrasts with both the source tale and Ozon's Criminal Lovers. Like Ozon's film, Breillat's characters move between masculine and feminine, homosexual, heterosexual, active, and passive. Her version of Sleeping Beauty interpolates Hans Christian Andersen's The Snow Queen in such a way as to foreground the chiasmatic relation between the two tales. In Sleeping Beauty, the heroine passively sleeps, and it is the prince who seeks her. In Andersen's The Snow Queen, the hero figuratively sleeps, and it is the heroine who seeks him and goes on a quest to recover the male character. By weaving these tales together, Breillat challenges normative gender and sexual constructions, and like Ozon, privileges homosexual sex as the site for the main character's sexual awakening. Like Perrault's tale, the action of Breillat's film is initiated by an old and spiteful fairy who curses the newborn princess to die at 16 when she pierces or transperce her hand, which a good fairy is able to modify into a 100-year sleep. Drawing on an opening in Perrault's tale in which the narrator informs us the princess had the pleasure of agreeable dreams during her long slumber, the good fairy of Breillat's film insists that the young princess Anastasia will have life in a dream during hers. Then the film moves to a 6-year-old Anastasia who pretends to be the knight Vladimir, and she hates dresses. While reading her favorite book, The Dictionary, in bed at night, she significantly comes across the definition of hermaphrodite. And this is really emphasized in the film because she'll do hermaphrodite, and then she'll spell it. Later reluctantly and rather ridiculously dressed for a ballet performance as a Japanese geisha, an idealized form of femininity, Anastasia accidentally pierces her hand with the hairpin and then is sent off on a dream journey that becomes a quest for her true love. Here she gets a little messier as she starts her journey, but I always think it looks very tacky, almost campy, the way she is dressed. One of the first stops in her journey is a humble home near the woods where a mother and her son Peter seem to be waiting for her arrival. For lack of female clothing, Anastasia's adoptive mother dresses her as a boy. Anastasia and her adoptive brother become very close until one night Peter sees the Snow Queen. And he feels as though a sword of ice pierces or transperce, so the same word is used as when she pierces her hand, his heart. As in Andersen's tale, the boy gets a splinter or snowflake in his eye and only sees the negative around him until one night he disappears with the Snow Queen. Anastasia then begins her quest to find Peter and comes across a young albino royal couple, Romany robbers, and then an old Lapland woman, all of whom assist her in her quest for Peter. It is when the 6-year-old Anastasia is about to find Peter that a 16-year-old Anastasia, so it's weird because in the film she falls asleep when she's 6, but then she awakens at 16. So as she's about to find Peter in her dream world, a 16-year-old Anastasia awakens from her long slumber to find Johann, the grandson of Peter, in her bedroom. But it is the Romany girl, now a woman, whom Anastasia had met in her slumbers, who initiates Anastasia's sexual awakening, preparing the princess for her less than ideal sexual experience with a fickle Johann. The film concludes with Anastasia's entry into the real world. Pregnant with a son she will name Vladimir, the name she gives herself. In the beginning of the film, she plays the name Vladimir. So she enters the real world, she's pregnant with a son she will name Vladimir, and is disappointed at the end with a tentative reunion with Johann. By interpolating the Snow Queen into the narrative of Sleeping Beauty, Breillat can highlight the parallels between the two tales and play with shifting gender positions in the film, evident in Table 2. So Anastasia pierces her hand, Ice pierces Peter's heart, so there's already this equivalency established between the two characters and their literal or figurative sleep. Unlike Perrault's Sleeping Beauty, the narrative focuses on the princess's quest for Peter, or the prince, and not the prince's or Johann's quest for the princess, thanks to the interpolation of the Snow Queen. Making her Sleeping Beauty into a female quest story, Breillat transforms the princess's slumber into a rite of passage from childhood to womanhood, which, quote, is often reserved in literature and cinema for boys. The notion that somehow Anastasia is the knight Vladimir is suggested precisely by the quest-like structure of the film. That Anastasia is both knight and sleeping princess is foregrounded in the child's fascination with the term hermaphrodite, and ends up materializing in the pregnant Anastasia, who carries the boy Vladimir within her own physical body. While the film follows Anastasia's challenging journey, it is not even clear how Johann found the palace where the passive Anastasia sleeps, thus short-circuiting the male quest of classical versions of Sleeping Beauty. In her analysis of Breillat's earlier films, Lisa Coutard discusses Breillat's interrogation of faux masculine chivalry, a concept applicable as well to Breillat's Sleeping Beauty. Drawing from the work of Zizek, Coutard argues that within the scheme of heteronormative forms of courtly love, desire can only be sustained by distance. Proximity to the real of the lady, quote, leads to brutal revulsion and rejection. In effect, explicit sex disrupts, quote, an idealized rhetoric of distance desire through an emphasis on actual desiring female bodies. So if you ever have seen any of Breillat's other films, she often uses graphic sexuality, and I think some of that is to disrupt, and it's clearer in other films, but I think it's happening more, I suppose, let's say more subtly in this film compared to her other work. That is, within heteronormativity, male desire is maintained through a sort of concealment, repression, or distancing of female desire and the actual act of sexual act. It is notable in Breillat's film that Johann refuses to take Anastasia out of her sleepy fairy tale world to bring her into his real world, a gesture that would take away Anastasia's elusive appeal to him. He insists on the strength of his supposed idealized love for her, all the while engaged in sexual relations with another woman in the real world. When a pregnant Anastasia escapes out into the real world and encounters Johann again, she clearly has become disenchanted with her so-called Prince Charming. But there is an opening in the film to a form of desire that satisfies in ways the heteronormative relation with Johann does not, Anastasia's relation with the Romany woman. Earlier in the dream sequence, Anastasia and the Romany girl share a closeness that recalls Anastasia's relation to Peter, who's Johann's grandfather, so they're kind of doubles. However, the Romany girl does not abandon her. When Anastasia wakes, it is the Romany woman who sexually fulfills Anastasia. Drawing from Garcia, we might view the homosexual initiation into sexuality as another means of questioning the heteronormative romance plot. For Garcia, quote, Breillat sets out to overturn the male fantasy that forms the subtext of nearly all the romantic fairy tales upon which young girls are weaned, that men awaken the virgin to her sexuality and by extension to her identity. Although Johann is present when Anastasia wakes up, it is the Romany woman who truly awakens Anastasia to her own sexuality. Breillat's film thus circumvents, again, the traditional plot of the source tale in which agency, including that of defining the heroine's place in society through sexuality or marriage, resides with the hero. To return to the concept of binary outlaws, Breillat's film, like Ozon's, creates fluid gender and sexual identities that challenge heteronormativity. By blending Perrault's Sleeping Beauty with Andersen's Snow Queen, Breillat is able to destabilize gender oppositions underpinning Perrault's heteronormative tale. Anastasia is hermaphrodite in the sense that she constantly shifts between roles associated with femininity and masculinity, including passivity and activity, just as the character of the prince, Peter or Johann, similarly moves between active and passive, masculine and feminine positions. Anastasia is both male and female, both active and passive, both heterosexual and homosexual. And as in Ozon's Criminal Lovers, in Breillat's Sleeping Beauty, sexual initiation happens through a same-sex encounter that leads to an unsatisfactory heterosexual encounter, putting the fairy tale of heteronormity into question. While Ozon's film capitalizes on the gender instability of Grimm's Hansel and Gretel to create a queer fairy tale, Breillat's film produces an interplay between Perrault's Sleeping Beauty and Andersen's Snow Queen that destabilizes the heteronormative gender and sexual structures constitutive of Perrault's tale, and that points to the non-heteronormative fissures in Andersen's tale. Luc and Anastasia become emblematic of the binary outlaw as they move between masculine, feminine, heterosexual, homosexual, active, and passive. As such, both films simultaneously challenge the classical heteronormative tale and generate new queer fairy tale forms. Thank you.
She's been very efficient.
So I guess we have lots of time for
Lots of
questions.
time for questions. Comments?
So what led you to these movies? And I guess, let me just,
Right.
Is this, I mean, I felt like your reading of these interpretations was very compelling. Do you see this as sort of a universal component of fairy tales, or do you see this as these, as particular to these interpretations?
I mean, I think, well, I guess just to, so I was working on Demy and his queering of fairy tales in his work, which is not unwritten, and he was actually really influenced by Jean Cocteau, who's a queer director and has been read by many scholars as a queer director. And Ozon was also, he was in turn influenced by Jacques Demy, So when I worked on my book Unto Me, I was looking at some of Ozon's films, and then afterwards I just started watching more and more of them and realized that there are these very strong connections between Ozon and Demi. So I think there's definitely a tradition in France of queer directors who look at the fairy tale form as a way to explore these questions of sexuality. Catherine Breillat has these very, like, her films she has various, I don't know if you've ever seen 36 Fillettes, like 36, it's basically the bra size of a young woman who's coming into her sexuality. So Breillat is mostly interested in her films in sexuality. And this goes through all of her films. Some of them are, borderline pornographic in her explorations. They can be very challenging films. And then recently, she has turned to the fairy tale. So she was going to do a trilogy, and she did a version of Bluebeard, and then she did Sleeping Beauty, and she was going to do Beauty and the Beast, and I don't know if that's going to happen. So I guess I find it interesting that these different filmmakers who are interested in exploring questions of sexuality go back to the fairy tales.
Yeah. I mean, I was trying to think about, is there something about
Fairy
when
tale.
Who writes this down, what's going on? Is there something there that kind of embeds this subversion? I don't know,
Right.
the wars of religion or whatever.
And I think there definitely, because I guess I think that there have been a lot of authors that go back, or like in Demi, for instance, he looks at Perrault's Donkey Skin about father-daughter incest. I mean, there's already these problematic in different ways forms of sexuality where, we always think of fairy tales as being the fairy tale princess, but I think it's really interesting that Breillat brings in Anderson's The Snow Queen, which is really a female quest story, and kind of enfolds it into this Sleeping Beauty. So she's using one fairy tale that has this underlying subversive quality to it to subvert Perrault's tale. And then, so I think a lot of these authors, or whether it's these filmmakers, are reading or looking at, I guess, the fissures, the gaps in the fairy tales to explore, they're shaking it
Well,
out.
and I like that there's a male and a female director. I mean, and I assume that's by design.
I didn't really think about it that
just
way.
because-
It's just like the films came together, they're exploring slightly different questions from different perspectives, but they're kind of doing very similar things.
So in the queering discourse in particular is interesting also in environmental studies, because people are suggesting that you can form all kinds of alliances by by queering sexuality, but then getting to queer critters and alliances with the non-human. It sounds like there's an interesting sort of migrant discourse that's going on in these stories. But I was looking at the Lapland and then the Disney scene in your first film, and just wondering whether or not it is primarily a discourse that circulates around sexuality, or whether hedgehogs, whether other things sort of come to speak and are queered in these films as well, whether fairy tales then become a way to talk about.
I actually think that, now that you said that, you could probably do a lot in Ozon with that. I think he might actually blur boundaries between human and non-human animals. Like, for instance, I think it was his first film sitcom, is a version of The Metamorphosis. A very, I guess, camp version of it. Well, he brings together The Metamorphosis and Pasolini's Teorema, which is like two completely different, I suppose in both there's a transformation that happens in the film. In Pasolini's film, it's this sexual transformation, or totally bursting apart this heteronormative bourgeois family. But there is a character who actually becomes animal, like literally, in the film. So, I actually think that could be a really interesting question to explore, especially with Ozon. I think there's less of that, although, like, Breillat's Bluebeard, there's a lot of, in Breillat, figurative and literal sort of devouring. Like, at the end of Bluebeard, because Bluebeard, if you know the story, he kills all his wives, and in Catherine Breillat's Bluebeard, it's actually a younger, a very almost just post-adolescent girl who marries Bluebeard, and at the end, she ends up killing him and decapitates him. And the last scene, there's a plate on her table with his head in it, and it's both reminiscent of the paintings about what is his name? The Syrian Holofernes. Is it Judith? Judith and Holofernes. So Breillat's definitely playing on that. But there's a scene at the same table where the two of them are devouring meat in a very, medieval way. So there is these notions of being devoured, of prey versus predator going on. So I think that would be an interesting place to go, definitely. Yeah.
So many ideas that you gave me, and I don't think that the audience can stand me filibustering for a half hour. So just a couple of things. The first thing is that I liked so much your charts and your templates. That's exactly what I like to do in everything I do. You, bristling with ideas, but very extremely precise in various relationships, almost like a matrix. But then I was asking myself, did the information technology industry take over on the fluidity of the sexual relationships? You have all these boundaries and things like that. Is there some sort of problem with presenting something that fluid with something that's pre-made by somebody who's making a profit? I must admit that I fall in love with those kinds of charts. That's my particular response to it. I think that was just, relationships were so beautifully set out. But what would you say about those discrete relationships that are sort of look boundary-like?
I guess I created boundaries in my charts, but I think in the films there's this it's constantly being blurred. Even in Ozon's film, being dead or alive, because you have, for a while, both, what is her name, Luc and the heroine, Alice, Luc and Alice in the basement cohabiting with Saeed's dead body. So there's a lot of, so I think so many I think that there's totally boundary crossing all the time in all of these films. I think they're taking those dichotomies and trying to break them up, which, I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, I think maybe a chart that strikes me as pertinent, but you might or you might not want to use it, is, do you know Lyotard's Le Différent, where he has all of these various games that can be played into the hundreds, where he tries to put together a reasonable discussion and interchange among infinite possibilities. That might be a way of doing it, where you have arrows.
Making the chart look more dynamic.
Making the chart look, but it's not just looking, I think it's an idea behind it.
I like that idea. I do.
And
if there are no boundaries, there's nothing to blur, nothing to cross. So it's a device, frame of mind, model. It's blurred. That's too simple.
If I might go again, some of the vocabulary that was used, like transpercé, made me think of mystical love. And I was thinking in the mystical context of, particularly of Saint Teresa and Saint John of the Cross, to put them in the same period. And I'm wondering, in all of the relationships that you made around desire, sexuality, and the body, if, as Janine was saying, if there's some religious sensibility that is there that could be addressed, or whether or not that's pushing things beyond what the authors are putting forth.
I mean, with Brea, that could be an interesting question because I think she very consciously is desacralizing in everything that she does. I mean, and I think that's one of the things that she's actually, you know, when you think of romantic love, one of the big things she's trying to do in all of her film is to desacralize that idea. So actually in one of her films, I can't remember if it was called Romance, where it's basically a woman engages in sadomasochism, and she actually is more, and it's very, very raw, you know, and very unromantic. It's almost methodical, where she sits down in the chair, the guy ties her up, is like, are they okay? You know, and it's this it's almost like a rationalist sex. That undoes any romance, and then she has this other relationship to another man, but in the end goes with this rationalist, weird, sadomasochistic scenario where she ends up being more respected than in sort of the traditional romance. So if anything, she's fighting against or challenging those sort of more mystical ways of looking at love, I think.
When you were talking, I was just thinking, I mean, there's also this sort of, I don't know, class, social status. I mean, do you see that as something that coexists with trying to undo and subvert this sexual tale?
Whether it's Ozon or Brea.
Well,
I
think the Ozon, I mean, clearly Said, I mean, his audience is gonna look at that and Said is gonna mean something to them.
Right.
In class, not just
Definitely,
ethnically,
and-
but in class terms, social status.
And I think actually the characters in Ozon in this particular film are more middle class, lower middle class.
Mhm.
But it's true that in Brea, a lot of her characters, well, like Anastasia's a princess.
Right, and then who is, again, a French audience seeing Romain Michel, that
Right.
means something instantly.
Right, no, that's true, like or even like the fact that the ogre, if you hear him, he sounds like Eastern European.
Mm-hmm.
So the transgression is, and the freeing up of desire,
Yeah.
because it's almost like in the beginning of Criminal Lovers, Luc is maybe afraid of his homosexual desire. Both of them could be afraid, or because Said is North African, he's taboo in several respects. So they kill that, but then later on we have Luc who embraces his queer desire. And then, it is interesting that the Romany woman is the one, so it's a different class, and the other who brings.
And really a group that's just as marginal in France as
As North Africans.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
Like who awakens the desire.
Right. And I think in France today that is more taboo than a homosexual relationship by a lot, right?
Right, exactly. No, that's an interesting point, I think. Definitely.
To make the chart messier.
Yeah. If I ever, because I would like to work. I don't know. I'm thinking I might work on another book on fairy tale film, fairy tale supernatural film, and I really would like to work more with, especially François Ozon, because for me he's like Jacques Demy's son.
It's interesting. We had in the history department last week a woman came to talk about digital humanities, and she had all these like moving charts and things where she described it as create your own adventure tales, where you kind of take different paths. And Michael, when you were talking, I thought something like that might be perfect for conceptualizing this in a visual way, which you would have to if you're doing so.
And actually, like one of the I don't think I quote her here. Kate Turner. This is a really interesting piece because she looks at Frau Trudy and looks at the witch as the other that is not supposed to be desired. And she does this whole queer reading of this girl seeking out this witch that is taboo. She's not supposed to be socializing with the witch. So she, in a way, I guess that follows a similar paradigm of the marginalized character, the one that's rejected by the community, is the one that awakes, you know, this desire that is unconstrained by social conventions. Any other questions?
May I just one?
Sure.
Talk a lot about subversion. My question is a contradiction to what I just said because I'm trying to binarize things. But just walk across the lines. Is the enjoyment the subversion and the breaking, or is there something that's positively desired, or are they mixed?
I think they're mixed, and I think the positive thing in both films is locating not one specific site, but a way of accessing one's, I mean, maybe you hate to use the word authentic desire, but, you know, kind of helping it's like the characters break out of structures of desire that do not satisfy them, you know? So that subversion and breaking through, it allows them to access in a way themselves and their own desires in ways that the channeling of desire in mainstream society doesn't allow them to do. So I think there's this definite freeing up.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, I encourage you all